Hey there, it's Mattea. Thanks for taking the time to listen to Bookends today. If you've been enjoying our show, it would be a huge help for us, and I think also for you, to follow us on your favorite podcast app, whether that's Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Overcast, whatever app you use to listen. This will ultimately help us make more Bookends episodes and connect you with more of your favorite authors. I hope you enjoyed today's show. Thanks so much for listening. Hey there, I'm Mattea Roach. Welcome to Bookends. Picture this. The year is 1942, and the world is engulfed in war. Men and women from across the country are pitching in to help Canada and the Allies win freedom and liberty abroad. And it's in this moment that Jack Wang sets his debut novel. The Riveter centers main character Josiah Chang. He's a Chinese-Canadian man fighting for recognition on the battlefield and at home, and doing all of that while pursuing the love of his life. I love a good Second World War novel, film, story, whatever. Documentaries about the Second World War and movies like The Best Years of Our Lives were given prime real estate on the living room TV in my house growing up. So I was excited to dive into a work of historical fiction that covered this period from a perspective I hadn't heard before. Jack Wang is the author of The Riveter. He grew up in Vancouver and now lives in Ithaca, New York. Jack was recently in Toronto, and he came into the studio for our conversation. Hi, Jack. Thank you for coming in.
It's my pleasure.
The Riveter takes place in Vancouver and then also overseas during the Second World War. Were you always interested in this period of history, or did you come to historical fiction through wanting to tell like a particular kind of story about a particular kind of character?
That's a great question. This story has lived with me for a long time, so I can't really remember the moment when I first heard about the exploits of Chinese Canadians during the Second World War. But as soon as I did, I became fascinated by, the courage and sacrifice of people who didn't have full citizenship rights, who couldn't vote, but nonetheless they were eager to serve their country and prove their loyalty. And I think that's when I really dove into the history. I read a book called The Dragon and the Maple Leaf by Marjorie Wang, and it's quite an exhaustive study of basically every Chinese Canadian who served in the First and the Second World War. And there's a very short passage about someone named Richard Marr, who was the only Chinese Canadian to serve in the 1st Canadian Parachute Battalion. And it says very little. It's just a couple of short paragraphs. Part of the task of historical fiction is to excavate the past and things that aren't necessarily in the archive, so to speak. And so the fact that there was so very little on Richard Marr, I saw an opportunity to imagine my way into a character like him. What must it have been like to be the only Chinese Canadian to serve in the 1st Canadian Parachute Battalion? I think that was my entree into this character.
It's a fascinating way to get into a character because I think sometimes the critique that you hear about historical fiction that focuses on these gaps in the archive and brings to life these characters from marginalized backgrounds who are not who you think of when you imagine, for instance, an Allied soldier who's participating in the liberation of Europe. And that's where we kind of meet your character, Josiah Chang, right? He's somebody who wants to serve his country, who's in this environment where he's not sure if he's going to be even allowed to serve because there were different rules affecting Chinese Canadians and their eligibility for service at that time. In the years leading up to the war, Josiah is almost like a kind of very traditional Canadian woodsman type character. He was a lumberjack. He grew up rurally in Caribou, British Columbia. And then his first kind of wartime job before he enters service is he's working as a riveter building ships. Can you paint us a bit of a picture of what kind of a character this is?
Sure. His name, as you mentioned, is Josiah Chang. And, those initials are meant to make people think of Johnny Canuck, who's kind of this, Canadian equivalent to Uncle Sam and is part of the popular imaginary and represents Canada and Canadiana. And he sort of reemerged during the Second World War as a cartoon figure, who fought fascism and the Nazis, and he was a lumberjack. And so Josiah Chang is an attempt to suggest that Chinese Canadians were very much Canadian and part of the history of this country. And so he is someone who starts as a faller or a lumberjack and moves into a wartime industry, building victory ships in a shipyard in Vancouver, as many Chinese Canadians did. And on the one hand, he's sort of a larger-than-life figure. You know, he's strong and he's able and he's confident. On the other hand, you know, we have to ask ourselves, why should, you know, an Asian male character who is simply strong and able and confident seem larger than life or unusual, right? You know, many stories depict Chinese males and Asian males differently, but I think that many Chinese Canadians, in fact, were full of self-belief like he was.
In the 1940s, Chinese Canadians were not considered equal citizens, didn't have access to the same sorts of rights that white settler Canadians did. Josiah is a character who's interesting because he's not an immigrant. He was born in Caribou, British Columbia. He's one of several generations of his family to have been born in Canada. What would life have been like for someone of Chinese ancestry living in British Columbia during this wartime period?
Yeah, I think because subsequent generations of Chinese Canadians have gone on to assimilate in Canadian society, gone on to be successful in many ways, and because new generations of Chinese immigrants often arrive already affluent or fairly affluent, I think we forget just how abject it was to be Chinese Canadian 100 years ago. Many people know about the head taxes that were levied expressly to keep people of Chinese descent out of Canada. By the time we reached the Second World War, the Chinese Immigration Act, otherwise known as the Exclusion Act, had been in effect for nearly 20 years. The goal was to keep Chinese out and also to essentially keep the population already in Canada from further growing. One couldn't be a doctor, one couldn't be a lawyer or a pharmacist or even a teacher, and one couldn't be a British subject, and so on. And so I think we really forget that Chinese Canadians were not just second, but even third-class citizens in the 20th century. But someone like Josiah Chang, you know, he's been in Canada, as you say, for a long time. And there is a point at which people cease to be immigrants, especially after many generations. My children, for example, in many ways have ceased to be immigrants, have ceased to understand the challenges of being an immigrant because they're so thoroughly assimilated. The challenge is that sometimes the culture, the society around you still sees you as the outsider.
We have this kind of contrast with this character, this love interest, Poppy, who's a white woman who grows up in Vancouver. She also sort of, I think, subverts in some ways and plays into in other ways this image of like the wartime working woman and wartime girlfriend that people might have picked up through seeing Rosie the Riveter propaganda posters or again watching older films about the Second World War. What did you want to do with this character of Poppy? Can you describe her a little bit for us?
Sure. You know, in many ways, Poppy is a woman who's a little bit ahead of her time. On the one hand, she's a jitney driver in the shipyard. But of course, many women moved into traditionally masculine roles during the Second World War. They worked in shipyards in all sorts of roles. In many ways, she reflected the opportunities that were afforded to women during the Second World War. She's also ahead of her time because, you know, she believes in sexual freedom and values her own desires. The choice to wait is much more complicated for her. And in fact, infidelity did go up during the Second World War. And one can understand why, right? To be separated from someone you love for an indefinite period of time, not knowing if that person will come home or not, and to have to wait faithfully the whole time, that can, of course, be a challenge. And so I wanted to examine that portrait of womanhood as a paragon of virtue, you know, and women is only faithful to be good. And I think that's where her complexity comes in as a character.
Yeah, she's certainly somebody who values her own agency and doesn't want to be shoehorned into this role of the faithful waiting girlfriend or wife at home. There's this additional dimension, though, that adds, I think, some even further depth to the texture of their relationship, which is the fact that they're an interracial couple during a time where that was not widely societally accepted. What are some of the challenges that a couple like Josiah and Poppy would have faced during this period of time?
Yeah, we have to remember that during the Second World War, there wasn't Canadian citizenship as such. People were still British subjects. We were still the Dominion of Canada. And women who married foreign nationals would have lost their British citizenship for doing so. But under British law, that only applied to women. It didn't apply to men. So there's a gendered aspect as well to Josiah's fight because women were treated unequally. So this is what Josiah is unwilling to do, is to cause Poppy to lose her birthright if they marry, and it's part of what compels him to go and fight. He doesn't discuss this with Poppy. He makes the decision of his own accord, and this produces some resentment in Poppy, and she resists the idea of simply bowing to his will. And I think that's part of the tension in their relationship.
Josiah sees enlisting as this sort of path forward to secure legal status both for him and for Poppy. How does he think that is going to work? And also, what challenges would he have faced? Because it wasn't a simple thing for a Chinese Canadian to simply go down to, their local recruitment office and enlist in the same way that a white soldier would have been able to at that time.
Right. At the very beginning of World War II, most Chinese Canadians lived in British Columbia. When Victoria and Ottawa realized that service became leverage for full citizenship rights, Chinese Canadians were barred from the military. So as you say, it wasn't a simple thing to just go down to your local recruitment office and join up. It wasn't until later on into the war, when the need for soldiers, the need for servicemen was so great, that first the Air Force relented, then the Navy, and finally the Army, and not until 1944. And Josiah's predicament really reflects the predicament of Chinese Canadians at the time, because there were two decided camps around the issue of service. Some people felt like this was a real opportunity to prove loyalty, to prove their equality, to prove that they were truly Canadians, and that this was the opportunity they had to seize in order to make the argument that they were entitled to full citizenship rights. But quite reasonably, many Chinese Canadians also felt, why should we put our lives on the line when we're second-class citizens? So Josiah Chang, he doesn't want necessarily at the beginning to join the military. It's only as circumstances evolve and he realizes, wait, I can't even marry the person I love without serious consequences, that the balance finally tips and he decides he has no choice but to serve.
Why do you think it was that at that time it was deemed more important to exclude Chinese Canadians from service and from citizenship than to prioritize the war effort?
So Chinese Canadians were excluded from conscription, for example. And, it goes to the understanding that if you served and you answered the call of duty, for your country, you would be able to petition for full citizenship rights, and that was something that British Columbia in particular was fearful of, because the largest Chinese Canadian population lived in British Columbia. And if you granted all these people the franchise, suddenly they would have very significant impact on, elections and ultimately power, right? So that was really the reason why Chinese Canadians were excluded, despite the desperate need for servicemen, because people understood that they would be able to leverage this for full citizenship rights.
Yeah, there was this real pervasive concern, I think, at this time that if the franchise were expanded to people from these immigrant backgrounds, you see kind of the same thing, I guess, with this is still a period of time. If we're thinking about the Second World War, Indigenous Canadians also didn't have the franchise and full citizenship rights at this point. Josiah at one point is training in the American South and is experiencing sort of Jim Crow era where Black Americans were really not recognized as full citizens, even though on paper they may have been. I want to talk a little bit about some of those scenes that take place in the American South. What inspired you to craft these scenes and to demonstrate this dynamic where Josiah is meeting Black Americans who also are navigating some of these same questions about, do I serve a country that doesn't respect me, that in many cases seems to want me dead, in hopes that I'm going to get something out of it, that I might be respected more, that I might access more rights, or do I stay home, realizing that some people are going to weaponize my choice to stay home against me?
Yeah, so one of the interesting tidbits in those short paragraphs from The Dragon and the Maple Leaf about Richard Marr was that he did his parachute training in Fort Benning, Georgia. And paratrooping was pretty much a new, military phenomenon during the Second World War. Canadians, Americans, and British really didn't have paratroopers, but as soon as the Germans started using paratroopers, the Allies realized perhaps we should train some paratroopers ourselves. So there was no parachute training school in Canada until they built Camp Shiloh in Manitoba. And before that, Canadians had to go to Fort Benning, Georgia to train. And I lived in the South. I went to Florida State University for my PhD. And so it was an opportunity to explore the connections between racial justice for Chinese Canadians, racial justice for Black Americans, and you mentioned Indigenous soldiers. There's an Indigenous soldier in my novel as well. And to draw a connection between these various groups who were fighting for victory, what was referred to in America as double victory, victory at home and victory abroad.
When we talk about war in contemporary times, there's an idea of soldier is a profession. It's something that you likely enlist and do for quite a stretch of time. And war is something that is happening kind of elsewhere. But in the context of the Second World War, so many men enlisted, so many women were involved in things like the WWII, and are kind of thrust into this environment where they're mixing together with people from different backgrounds, whether that's ethnic or class. What does that do to a society when we sort of see some of that class or ethnic stratification break down because people are put in a situation where they have to serve together?
Yeah, that's a great question. At the time of the Second World War, 1 in 10 Canadians was involved in the military in some way, either actively or in some auxiliary service. In the case of men, it was up to 20% actively involved. These days, being a soldier is professionalized, and it's a duty we leave to those who choose it as a profession by and large. But during the Second World War, it was a time of what I think of as the citizen soldier, ordinary people volunteering to serve in the military. And as you say, someone who was just a teacher last week or a lawyer or a pharmacist or something would suddenly sign up, leave their ordinary life, and go to war. And it makes me think of some of the news that came out of Ukraine, for example. Something that seemed startling was that someone who was just a teacher last week, so to speak, was suddenly on the front lines, suddenly putting their life at risk in order to defend their country. And especially in the contemporary world, that fills us with a kind of awe and admiration because most of us can hardly imagine, right, abandoning a radio station, for example, and going off to war. But this is what, ordinary Canadians across the country did during World War II and elsewhere, of course. World War II was a time of enormous mobility. People who otherwise lived in small towns suddenly went to big cities, and people in big cities suddenly went to other countries and other parts of the world. For all the terrible things that came out of the Second World War, it was a time where people truly broadened their horizons. And this included, of course, a broader understanding of different people, different places. And in all of the research I've done, there's a very strong suggestion that Chinese Canadians felt the greatest sense of belonging when they were in the military than anywhere else in their lives, because as soon as you put on the uniform, you were equal. People did not look at you as less than. And in some ways, the end of the war marked for some a sadness because they had to return to their ordinary lives when they could be looked on as less than. But once you put on the uniform, people saw you as Canadian.
You mentioned in that response, in contemporary times, looking at footage and hearing news about the war in Ukraine, for instance, where we actually do see footage of war and of violence happening. And you don't shy away from describing that violent nature of war in literary terms in your novel and really lean into the kind of senselessness of a lot of it. Why did you choose to depict these detailed battle scenes and kind of graphic scenes of death and people losing limbs, people bleeding out on the battlefield?
Yeah, I don't think there's any war novel that's worth its salt that isn't also at least a questioning, if not an indictment of war itself. Because war, no matter the cause, ultimately is obscene. The things that happen in war and the things that human beings choose to do to one another, and the investment of time and energy and material to destroying one another is obscene. And you can't convey that if you're not honest about what war looks like. Part of it is, of course, that sometimes there's inherent drama in the actions of war. And as a writer, I'm interested in holding attention. And sometimes battles, even carnage, hold attention. But it's important to be honest about the cruelties of war and the obscenities of war, including things that are done to civilians. Horrible things happen to civilians in the novel, as they do in all war. It also, of course, dramatically becomes a testing ground for the morality of the characters and whether or not Josiah and other people in the midst of war can maintain their moral bearings.
Yeah, there definitely seems to be some engagement with this question of is any sort of violence in response to an enemy that is so evil justified, right? And there's this one scene that was so powerful to me where one of Josiah's colleagues, a fellow enlisted man, lashes out and kills an unarmed German prisoner of war. And it becomes this moment of great tension where some of the other soldiers are almost saying, Josiah, you're soft for not thinking that this is okay. You're just as bad as the people we're fighting against. What did you want to explore by depicting these kinds of ethical conversations between soldiers that are happening in a battlefield context?
Well, Josiah, joins the service not necessarily because he's eager to kill the enemy, but because he's eager to earn rights for himself. So he's always a little bit uncertain about the moral task before him because over the course of his experiences, he realizes that German society is in many ways not that different from Canadian society in terms of its desire to expunge certain people, its desire to, make certain people second-class citizens and so on. And so for him, he is fighting both his own country and the enemy at once. And that's sort of part of the moral tension for him. He's not that eager necessarily to go and kill Germans as some of his colleagues are. And that's why at the end of the novel, he is kind of literally haunted by some of the people that he's killed.
There was some interesting texture in this novel talking about the idea of war having rules, war having laws. And that's one thing that Josiah learns as he enlists and is being trained, that there are situations where you actually do, allow the enemy to wave the white flag, to move, for instance, injured men off the battlefield. And then that happens. And then there's a moment where the battle resumes. And I found this really interesting to read about in a contemporary context, because I feel like when I see footage now of the war in Ukraine or the war in Gaza, I feel like there's not this same sort of notion that there's a point where war can stop and there are not rules. I'm wondering whether you, as a writer and as someone who's done a lot of historical study in putting together this book, have any thoughts about whether our ideas about the laws of war and the rules of war have changed over time.
Yeah, so there was a scene relatively early on in the novel when Josiah's in Normandy, and as you say, Germans put up the white flag, and they're in the middle of a gunfight, and it suddenly ceases, and the Germans come over and ask if they can move some of the injured. And Josiah is startled. He thinks, wow, in the middle of war, you can call a timeout. And he realizes then that war had rules refereed by honor. But of course, honor is a difficult thing to maintain in the midst of war in order to follow those rules. I don't know if things have changed. I think actually war is a very ancient phenomenon. And although we've tried our best to humanize war, I think in some ways this tension between honor and lack of honor has always existed. And I think that in some ways it is maybe exacerbated in the modern world, but it is part of, unfortunately, the ancient phenomenon of war.
Mm. You seem to have such a literacy, not just in the time period that your novel covers, but also in the classics, and really taking a long view when thinking about what sorts of things you want to incorporate into your writing. But you've also said that you find, as a writer, you kind of refract your own experiences through different times and different places to find what's interesting to you about those times and places. I'm wondering if you can elaborate a bit on what you mean by that.
I think different writers have different strengths, and some are really good at making fiction out of their own experience. They write maybe autobiographical or semi-autobiographical fiction that's really interesting. And these days, autofiction is very much in vogue, and some writers are great at that. And it turns out that I was never very good at that. When I wrote thinly veiled versions of myself, the stories always seemed kind of flat and less interesting. In order to write about myself, I think I had to refract my own experiences through different kinds of characters in different times and places. So you asked at the beginning about historical fiction and my interest in it. And this is not my first venture into historical fiction. In my short story collection, I wrote stories, for example, about the Second Sino-Japanese War. I wrote about Kristallnacht, or the Night of Broken Glass in Europe, right before the Second World War. And what I find is that all of these stories involve parts of myself and what I understand about the world. But I have the opportunity for more interestingness, as it were. And every writer is ultimately searching for interestingness when I can set a story in a different place, under different circumstances, so that I'm not just writing about thinly veiled versions of myself. Also, I think that there are stories out there that talk about what it might be like to be, first-generation immigrant in Canada. And I wanted to tell and excavate some stories that I think are underappreciated.
I'm wondering, you're kind of like a late career writer and teacher to be releasing a debut novel, which is amazing.
Right.
When you were a younger reader and writer, what do you think it might have meant to you to see a story like the one that you've published in the Riveter, to see stories like those that you mentioned in your previous short fiction collection?
Yeah, when I was a young writer, I didn't necessarily write about characters like myself. People hearing me now talk about Chinese Canadians, for example, serving the Second World War. It might seem very intuitive to them that a writer like me would write about this subject, right? But when I was a younger writer, I took a short story class at the University of Toronto. We read the Norton Anthology. And I think the only person of Chinese descent in that collection was Amy Tan. And I think because of what I was reading, I thought certain kinds of characters and certain subjects were the purview of literature or were not the purview of literature. So it actually took me a long time to realize, actually, I wanted to write about people like myself and to tell underappreciated stories about what it meant to be Chinese Canadian. And perhaps that was part of the long journey for me. Part of it was also that I didn't necessarily know that I wanted to be a writer when I was 5 or 6, like many writers claim. It wasn't until I was an undergraduate that I first got the inkling that I might want to write. And so sometimes we have a feeling that we want to write before we know what we want to write about, and also before we have very much command of craft. And so it just took me time to discover my real subject and to gain the command of craft to the point where I felt happy with the stories I was writing.
I want to end by asking about the dedication to the Riveter, because you dedicate the book to your wife and to your daughters. I'm wondering what you hope your children will take away from this book. Like, have they read it? Do you hope that this is a document that they're going to read and feel like, I understand something about myself and my family and what it means to be in this country more after having read this? I've
given the book to both my daughters, and my older daughter is reading it now. Judging by the book lying around her room, thumbed through, I think she's reading it as we speak. I dedicate the book to them because I'm a late bloomer. I've just spent so much time away from them. And I wish I had published when I was younger so that when my children were born, I could do nothing else but pay attention to them. But it was after my children were born that I was most desperate to get a book out in the world. I've, had to spend so much time away from them, locked away in my writer's garret. But, I hope that what they come to appreciate is that the freedoms they enjoy, and it's a reminder to myself, it's a reminder to other people of my generation, to Canadians who will come after me, that these rights were hard won. And it wasn't always the case. And the arc of the moral universe is bending, and can continue to bend for others. I mean, I think that a novel is always particular, but it's also metaphoric. And there are many other people who are still in an analogous situation, who don't have full citizenship rights in a place or in a country. And so what can we do to expand that circle of freedom and equality for everyone? It's not just to look at the past, but also at the present and the future.
Jack, thank you so much for coming in to chat with me today.
Thanks so much. Great to be here.
That was Jack Wang with me in our Toronto studio. His debut novel is called The Riveter, and it's out this week. This episode was produced by Lisa Matthews with help from Barb Carey and Katie Swales. Ailey Yamamoto is our associate producer. Our senior producer is Jacqueline Kirk, and our executive producer is Aaron Balser. Shout out to our audio tech, Aronde Williams, and to the CBC Books team who bring you all the goods on social media and on our website. If you enjoyed today's show, you should check out the Bookends archive, which you can find on any podcast app. Here's a bit of my conversation with Vivi Ganeshananthan. We see this kind of disappearance of young men from the fabric of civil society where they're joining militant groups, they're dying in conflict. Like, what does that do to a society? It's so drastic seeming to me.
What does it do to a society to have its young people targeted in this way, and specifically its young men? I mean, I think the division and militarization of society as people who had been Tamil civilians take up arms and become Tamil militants, as the Sri Lankan military and Indian peacekeepers move into this space and everyone's carrying arms. Like, what does that mean for the people who aren't carrying arms, who, by the way, are primarily women and children? Mm-hmm. Right? There is a way that surveillance crept into every aspect of society, including spaces that were only Tamil people, where Tamil people might be surveilling each other to see what their allegiances were. Do we believe that you're behaving appropriately in this situation? So it becomes a pretext for intense distrust. And there is a part in the book where Sashi sort of talks about the language for death. And the language for death has been, to that point, primarily language for the old. And they don't really have language for the death of young people, which was a point that one of my friends made to me. She was reading the book and she sort of said, that we didn't know how to talk about this, because the actual death rituals are the children mourning the parents, not the parents mourning the children.
You can head to the link in the description to catch the rest of that conversation. Make sure to follow Bookends to access our archive of interviews and to keep up with some of the fantastic guests we have coming up. And of course, you can always catch the show on Sundays and Wednesdays on CBC Radio. I'm Mattea Roach, and this is Bookends. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time. Because when the book ends, the conversation begins.